What's up, everybody? This is Alex with Comic Book Historians. I've been asked to re-upload a couple of my older videos. The Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, who created what at Marvel, but without the music background, which I totally get. These videos were done in my older Docuseries style. I hope you enjoy the overall composite video by combining them together into one thing. For more information on this topic, you can go to comicbookhistorians.com under the article section. You'll see more there. And go ahead and click on that silky smooth subscribe button down below, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Stan Lee created an incredible superhero entertainment franchise in the 1960s. However, there are claims of who created what and controversies of stolen credit that have tainted their work in the decades since. Let's go down our timeline for each of the two crowning achievements of the 1960s Marvel Age: Fantastic Four with Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, and The Amazing Spider-Man with Steve Ditko and Stan Lee. As shown in previous episodes, Jack, Stan, and Steve co-created the Marvel Universe in the 1960s, but there have been differing accounts since of who created what and tension between all three creators that are interesting to examine. What blurs the waters even more is the Marvel method, which claims that Stan Lee gave them an idea, they'd flesh and plot it out and give it back to him to dialogue. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee co-created Fantastic Four 1, 1961, which started off the Marvel Universe, and the credit for the first issue reads like this on the right side. Steve Ditko and Stan Lee co-created Spider-Man in 1962, and the credit in his first appearance in Amazing Fantasy 15, 1962 reads like this on the bottom of the first page. So the credits of the creative team appear very straightforward in these panels. Now watch as the credits change over time. Let's start with the Fantastic Four. Fantastic Four 9, 1962 shows the creative credit change to Stan Lee as scriptwriter and Jack Kirby as artist. In Fantastic Four 17, 1963, the credit changes again to Stan Lee for the story and Jack Kirby for art. Then in Fantastic Four 18, 1963, the credit changes to the story being written by Stan Lee and again Jack Kirby for what is drawn. On the Spider-Man credits, the credit from Amazing Fantasy 15 shown earlier changes quickly in the first issue of Amazing Spider-Man 1963 to Stan Lee for the script and Steve Ditko for art. The credit changes again in Amazing Spider-Man 3, 1963 to story by Stan Lee and then art by Steve Ditko. The credit changes again in issue 5, 1963 to written by Stan Lee and drawn by Steve Ditko. So on both books, which were the cornerstones of the Marvel Universe in the 1960s, the credits were quite collaborative, and as the books became popular hits, the credit for the story and ideas therein flow more toward Stan Lee. So what does Stan mean in 1963 when it says written by? In 1967, Daredevil Annual 1, a 3-pager by Gene Colan and Stan Lee of an encounter between them, Stan Lee shows that written means he fills in the dialogue boxes left for him by the penciler who mapped out the story in picture panels. It also shows Stan having a hard time coming up with an original story idea. This satire could be solely in jest or funny because it's true. Who knows? By some accounts, Stan Lee and a few others have said that he would give them an initial idea, the artist mapped it out, and he filled in dialogue bubbles after. Other accounts have said that there was never an initial idea and that Stan would receive pages with story and art panels originated by the artist and Stan would fill in the dialogue bubbles later. At this point, it is a game of he said, and there's no way to prove it. However, it is interesting to see published accounts of what some depict versus others in this controversy. So let's travel down the timeline to what is published regarding credit over at Marvel in the 1960s, especially in relation to Stan Lee and his creative partners Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko with a few others. In 1966, Stan Lee had an interview for the New York Herald-Tribune, and they portray a Marvel method plotting session between Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, which appears fairly collaborative. Later on in 1966, Stan Lee had an interview with the Chicago Sun-Times Midwest where in a couple separate paragraphs he says, "What we were doing was creating fairy tales for adults." Note that he said the term we, denoting a collaborative group creation effort, which is admirable compared to what he says later in life. However, on the sidelines, the magazine editor or writer wrote that he created the new breed of superheroes like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. In the magazine's caption, they write specifically that it was he and not them that created those characters. This seems to be a common theme in his interviews where he says something and the media says another. Maybe it's just lazy journalism. I don't know. Did he tell them he created, or was that interpreted by the magazine writer because he was socially charismatic in his discussions? But that sort of thing rubs the pencilers, plotters like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko the wrong way. In Sick Magazine 48, 1966, there are satire pages written by Joe Simon, Jack Kirby's ex-partner of many years, discussing Stan's credit grabbing at Marvel. In Angel and Ape 2, 1969, which mimics Roy Thomas and Stan Lee, inked by Wally Wood, they made Roy look like Stan and called his character Stan Bragg, and Stan looked like Roy, discussing signing work that isn't theirs in The Most Fantastic Robbery in History. Script by Sergio Aragonis and Bob Oxner. Pencils are by Oxner. In 1970, Jack left Marvel for DC, and Kirby said in an interview with Blast Comic Collector 81, 1970 that he created the Fantastic Four. Stan Lee was on To Tell the Truth show in 1971. At this time, he was editor of Marvel and soon to be publisher. It is possible that his old creative partner Jack Kirby saw this 1971 episode and satirized Stan Lee, toupee and all, in Mr. Miracle 6, 1972. This issue was made after Jack left Marvel and went over to DC and satirized Stan Lee as Funky Flashman, as a verbose user and abuser of artistic talent, working as a driver of slaves in a happy Marvel family. In 1973, Stan Lee had been publisher for a year by then, and Kirby had been at DC for 3 years at this time, and in Foom 1, 1973, Marvel would turn up Stan's sole creatorship claim up a notch by writing that Stan Lee created the Marvel Age of Comics. In 1974, Stan Lee's personal language on the creation of the FF changes, where he claimed sole creatorship of the characters that he gave co-creatorship to in both prior interviews and earlier issue credit. So there is a definite change in Stan's recollection and creator credit compared to his 1966 interview, where he used the term we. At the same time, he discusses how it was his wife who inspired this sudden urge to create in his comics after 20 years in the business. In 1974, Jack Kirby returned to Marvel. A few years after, he depicted Stan Lee as Funky Flashman and said this about his time with Stan in the early 60s as a couple of guys who, quote-unquote, shared ideas. In Foom 11, 1975, Kirby had already now been at Marvel, and the language at Foom changes from Stan's sole creatorship to a co-creation shown here, speaking with Kirby. Later on in this interview, Jack discusses how happy he was at Marvel, as if it was an old family. This is also an interesting change in language from Jack when he was back at Marvel compared to his sentiments that he expressed in Mr. Miracle 6, 1972, when he was at DC Comics. In 1975, Stan Lee was interviewed over in the United Kingdom working on Marvel UK duties when he said this regarding Jack Kirby in Fantasy Advertiser International, April of 1975 edition. He specifically says that Jack Kirby had a lot of great ideas but needed an editor to control him. In 1978, Jack Kirby said this about his collaboration with Stan Lee in Foom 19, 1977. He speaks positively about his time with Stan Lee, writing, "I've always enjoyed working with Stan. We've been a successful team. In the collaboration, something good comes out." This is clearly a far more positive tone by Jack Kirby regarding Stan Lee than what we will read later. Since Roy Thomas was mentioned in the satire panels, what did he think about Jack and Stan's co-creation of the Fantastic Four? In 1978, Roy Thomas said in Collector's Dream fanzine that the Fantastic Four's spirit derived from Jack Kirby's Challengers of the Unknown 1957, which is different than what Stan wrote in 1974, but more in line with the early credits that Stan once gave Jack in the early FF issues and the aforementioned 1966 interviews. Here is a short visual comparison of 1957 Jack Kirby Dave Wood's Challengers of the Unknown versus Jack Kirby Stan Lee's Fantastic Four. Jack Kirby left Marvel in 1978 to work in animation, then does some work with his Darkseid character in the 1980s, meanwhile struggling with Marvel in the 1980s to get his original art back, as well as try to delineate once and for all that he co-created the Fantastic Four, which didn't occur for a while. He had some encounters with John Byrne as well, which is discussed in the previous episode, and then in 1987 it was Jack Kirby's 70th birthday and he was interviewed on a radio show. Roughly 18 minutes into the interview, Jack Kirby says he had a deep role in the creation of Spider-Man, and that all comic book art pages he turned during his 11 years at Marvel were all creatively his, except for the dialogue and the balloons. Stan Lee calls in a couple minutes after that, and they discuss a positive tone of working together with an acknowledgement of it being difficult to know for sure who did what. At 33 minutes, Stan Lee says that every word of dialogue is mine, every story, and then Jack says, "I wrote a few lines myself, and it was the action I was interested in." In 1990, he had an interview in the Comics Journal 134 with Gary Groth. At this point in his life, Jack is older and 4 years from death, with a large amount of disappointment of what little credit or money he received for his Marvel co-creations. That interview can be found here. At this point in his life, Jack is older and 4 years from death, with a large amount of disappointment of what little credit or money he received for his Marvel co-creations. First, Jack establishes that Stan Lee wasn't a writer or creator, but only an editor. Jack then establishes that it was he that created the Fantastic Four and the other characters and created all the stories, while Stan was more of a desk organizer of talent. Jack then tells Gary that Stan did not create the Fantastic Four. Jack Kirby also discusses he couldn't ever talk to Stan about his concerns with the application of credit on their Marvel issues, and further says Stan was the editor of Marvel, had all the influence, and was the point man, so Stan could do whatever he wanted with the pages. Jack goes on to say that he would word the pages as well before handing them in. Jack has mentioned that he continued to go along with the process because he was blackballed from DC, as discussed in an earlier episode, and needed the freelance fees to support his wife and family. Take in mind that Roz, his wife, corrected Jack on the placement of the words in the above quote, showing that he misremembered a detail in this interview, so there is a chance he misremembered other details. Jack also says that he solely conceived the stories for the pages and explained how Stan flattered him to take more of his ideas. Jack then warns Gary of ever working with that sort of personality. Roz Kirby, Jack's wife, even asked the question, what did Stan actually create before Jack came along and after he left? This 1990 interview with Gary Groth is an imprint of the type of emotions that he probably took to his death. It lays a despondent picture of someone who feels exploited. In 1991, Fantastic Four 358 prints a letter from Stan Lee describing that the following 2 pages are 2 out of 4 pages of his original script, which plotted the first issue of the Fantastic Four dated July 1961. This document was not seen until the 1980s. Jack died in 1994, and Stan Lee was seen at Jack Kirby's funeral. In Fantastic Four 400 in 1995, Stan Lee writes again on the origins of the Fantastic Four, and it differs significantly from his 1974 Origins book. He specifically writes that Jack Kirby and I created the Fantastic Four in a more collaborative effort similar to his 1966 interview. In 1998, Roy Thomas said that Stan Lee wasn't sure if he wrote the Fantastic Four 1 synopsis before or after speaking to Jack Kirby first in Jack Kirby Collector 18, 1998. Dick Ayers wrote and illustrated his autobiography in 2005 as the Dick Ayers story and depicted their relationship with Ayers wanting more storytelling credit. In 2014, the Jack Kirby estate heirs and Marvel Disney settled and finally gave co-creator credit to Jack Kirby along with Stan Lee. Oddly enough, it took 53 years for the current Marvel credits, shown bottom, to finally reflect the original credits shown in Fantastic Four 1, 1961. Regarding Steve Ditko, he had some contention with Stan Lee and a particular point of contention with Jack Kirby, both regarding Spider-Man. The creation of Spider-Man takes a circuitous route based on many sources, so let's start off a few years after Stan is finished with the fine-tuning the credits in the Amazing Spider-Man comic book. Steve Ditko starts to get plotting credit on both Amazing Spider-Man and Doctor Strange in 1965. In January 1966, Stan Lee has his interview with the New York Herald-Tribune and gives his take on Steve Ditko at this time, saying he doesn't plot Spider-Man anymore, and that there is schism going on in the direction of Spider-Man's personal life. He also discusses that they argued over plot lines and that Ditko thinks he's a genius of the world that needs to ink his own pages. Steve Ditko was evidently unhappy with his working arrangement with Stan Lee and left Marvel later that same year in 1966, then did some work at other companies like Charlton and DC. After Steve's departure, there was now a vacuum at Marvel to tell the story of how Spider-Man was created, so on the end credits on the 1968 Amazing Spider-Man cartoon, it shows Spider-Man was created by Stan Lee with no mention of Steve Ditko. So Stan Lee wrote that in his 1974 Origins book that he wanted a teenage character with a name kind of like Superman, and that he loved the idea of a spider character because he read the Spider pulp when he was younger, and convinced his publisher Martin Goodman, a cousin-in-law, to go forward with his Spidey idea. Stan also wrote that he originally gave his Spider-Man teenager idea to Jack Kirby, who drew the character too heroically and felt he wanted a realistic, grounded approach from Steve Ditko, and gave the project to him instead. In 1975, Stan was asked about the circumstances around Steve Ditko leaving Marvel and Fantasy Advertiser International, and he answered that Steve got more socially withdrawn, professionally demanding, more impossible to work with, and then left the company. Steve continued to work at other companies and then worked at Marvel again in 1978. In 1979, Fireside Publishing released a reprint of Doctor Strange with 80% of the art by Steve Ditko, with a final story at the end by Barry Windsor Smith. There were some pages written by Stan depicting the history of Doctor Strange, the other main Ditko Marvel co-creation, and Stan wrote that Steve Ditko dreamed up the story and the art, and that his own job was to fill in the dialogue balloons. To be clear, this is in regards to Doctor Strange only, and Spider-Man is not mentioned in this Fireside book. However, I bring it up here in the context of Steve Ditko and his time at 1960s Marvel. Throughout the 1980s, Steve Ditko created various characters like Captain Universe and Speedball. In 1982, Jack Kirby had an interview with Spirit creator Will Eisner, who said Spider-Man was discussed between Joe Simon and myself. Spider-Man was not a product of Marvel. What did Jack Kirby mean by this? Joe Simon adds more to the story in his 2003 comic history text, The Comic Book Makers, which we discuss later. In 1986, Comics Interview 45, Jack Kirby says that Ditko developed Spider-Man and that it was the artist that come up with the stories and art, and Stan was essentially a production coordinator. Stan Lee marries Spider-Man and Mary Jane on TV, while Stan Lee claims sole Spider-Man creatorship in 1987. Based on a 1988 interview, Greg Theakston writes in the Steve Ditko Reader Volume 1, 2002, a quote from Eric Stanton, a fellow artist in the same one-room studio as Ditko at the time of Spidey's creation, says he helped come up with the idea for wrist web shooters. My contribution to Spider-Man was almost nil. When we worked on storyboards together, I added a few ideas, but the whole thing was created by Steve on his own. He continued, the whole thing was Steve Ditko. I think I added the business about the webs coming out of his hands, and we talked about the characters, and in turn he helped me with my stuff. In 1990, Joe Simon stated in the Comics Journal 134 in 1990 that his co-creation The Fly from 1959 eventually became Spider-Man, published in 1961. In 1990, during Jack Kirby's Gary Groth interview, Jack specifically said he created Spider-Man, the costume, and the first cover. Steve Ditko replied to this that this was factually wrong statement from Jack Kirby and had this to say about who created the costume in 2001. Here's the unpublished first cover of Amazing Fantasy 15, penciled by Steve Ditko, that was passed over by Stan in favor of the second published cover that Jack penciled and Steve inked. This unused cover is featured on the back of Marvel Mania Magazine 2, 1970. In a 1990 Steve Ditko article shown again and discussed in Alter Ego 2001, Steve Ditko contests Jack Kirby's claim of creating the costume, saying that he received a sketch of Jack Kirby's costume which was more like Captain America, and also saying that Steve himself created the costume, look and movement, web shooters, etc. Steve Ditko also discusses the 5-page synopsis that he received from Stan, which was a product of a conversation between Stan and Jack, which went mostly unused, including a penciled splash picture of the Jack Kirby drawn Spider-Man. He also wrote Stan said Spider-Man would be a teenager with the magic ring, which could transform him into an adult hero Spider-Man. I said it sounded like The Fly, which Joe Simon had done for Archie Publications. Kirby had penciled 5 pages of his Spider-Man. How much was pure Kirby, how much was Lee, is for them to resolve. This early version reminded Steve Ditko of the Archie comic by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby called The Fly, and he has written that he pointed out the similarity to Stan Lee, so Stan wisely chose to give Ditko the project, likely to make it different from The Fly, and add his own Ditko flair to the character. In 1990, Steve Ditko discussed his creative input into the Spider-Man character in an insider's part of comics history. He mentions what part of Spider-Man's creation was from Stan Lee and what parts were from Steve Ditko to prove that no one person created Spider-Man, and that he had the most visual and kinetic input into the character's genesis. This is meant to illustrate from Steve Ditko that everything we love seeing in Spider-Man came from himself. Stan Lee wrote in 1999 that he always considers Steve Ditko Spider-Man's co-creator. Here is Steve Ditko's response to that and a few other inconsistent Stan quotes on both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange's creation that he collected and published in 2001 in Mini History, as well as Stan joking that he will take credit for anything not nailed down. In his Tampa Tribune interview, December 7, 1999, Steve Ditko writes, Stan was asked to name his favorite creation. Stan says, I don't know, Doctor Strange, well, Spider-Man. He is the most famous character I created. And a Stan Lee letter in the Comic Reader number 6, 1963, Stan Lee writes, we have a new character named Doctor Strange. 'Twas Steve's idea. Steve Ditko had this to say in 2001, showing that the two names at the end of the first Spider-Man story in Amazing Fantasy 15, 1962, does not necessarily indicate creator status. The credits read Stan Lee and S. Ditko, the way many 5-page stories Stan and I did were credited. There's no identification of writer, scripter, illustrator, or artist, Steve Ditko writes. No indication of any creator status. 2 names, 2 people are credited with doing 11 pages of Spider-Man. There is no Stan Lee full script, but a synopsis. So what did Jack Kirby mean in 1982 when he said Spider-Man was a product of him and Joe Simon? Joe Simon wrote in his 2003 book, Comic Book Masters, "In 1953, I created a superhero, a young man with spider-like qualities. I put the character in presentation for a publisher and entitled it Spider-Man. I had C.C. Beck do the pencil sketches. He was the predominant artist for Captain Marvel, the man who gave Captain Marvel its special comic style, and I believe he came out of semi-retirement to work with me on this. At the last minute, I changed the name from Spider-Man to the Silver Spider. I thought at the time there were just too many man titles around, Superman, Batman, and that stuff. I took the presentation up to Harvey Comics where it languished. Here's a one-page 1954 affidavit from Joe Simon to describe to the letter's recipient his vision for the Silver Spider as having the powers of a spider who webs wings and has gadgets. Here are 2 pages from the Silver Spider, which was originally published in Pure Images 1, 1977, originally made in 1953. It is further explained that this 1953 boy finding a ring to turn him into the Silver Spider is the same scene used by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon in 1959 in the Fly comic. To further see how the first 1959 Fly comic panel choreography matches with Amazing Fantasy 15 1961, make sure to read or watch the Spider-Man section of a previous CBH episode, Jack Kirby, co-creator of the Marvel Universe. Although Joe Simon claimed he came up with the name Spider-Man first in 1953 in relation to Captain Marvel's artist C.C. Beck, there is a Captain Marvel villain named Spider-Man in Whiz Comics 89 by publisher Fawcett Comics, which would to me seem more likely why Simon didn't use a name to possibly avoid a legal conflict. That Spider-Man that Joe Simon may have known wasn't the first comic Spider-Man. In 1934, Ed Whelan made his detective serial titled Spider-Man. So the name Spider-Man was used a couple of times before. However, back to Joe Simon, he also published what his original 1953 Spider-Man logo looked like in his 2003 book. This is what Jack Kirby is likely referring to in his 1982 quote on the Spider-Man that he and Joe Simon worked on, and that he goes further on to say that he brought that to Stan Lee. In 2005, Strange and Stranger, The World of Steve Ditko, Lee says, much later I asked Ditko if he would ever consider coming back to do one final Spider-Man story. To my surprise, he said, not until Goodman pays me the royalties he owes me. I had no idea what he was talking about, as Martin usually kept me apprised of such things. Jonathan Ross interviewed and confronted Stan Lee on Who Created Spider-Man in 2007. He shows that although he considered Steve a co-creator, he still feels he dreamed it up himself because he came up with a teenage character with the name Spider-Man. Joe Simon died in 2011, but before he died, he painted a picture of what his 1950s Spider-Man looked like, which appears to be a combination of his Fly character and the Fly villain Spider Spry. In 2012, Stan Lee says in an interview that he came up with the idea for Spider-Man, and then I saw a fly crawling on a wall, Stan says, and I said, boy, it sure would be great if I could get a superhero who could stick to walls like an insect. In 2015, Steve Ditko gives his perception of why he quit Marvel, which is interesting to compare to the 1975 Stan Lee version above. Here is a couple paragraphs from his 2-page explanation. Generally, when Steve Ditko turned in his Spider-Man pages, Stan Lee would go through a feedback session with him. That seemed to change after Ditko argued and got plotting credit for both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange in 1965. At this point, Stan Lee stops talking to him and has his assistant Saul Brodsky be intermediary. Steve felt he was not being treated well because Stan stopped talking to him and later decides to quit Marvel, and mentions here that Stan never asked him why he left. Some interpret this as Stan didn't want to engage in any plotting discussion if Steve's pay and credit was upgraded as plotter to focus on other things that need his attention in a busy office. Others look at it as a passive-aggressive retaliation from Stan against Steve for taking some plotting money that used to go to him. Who knows? Either way, Steve Ditko felt ignored and left, according to his own accounts. Here are 2 comic pages put together to review both versions of Spider-Man's creation according to Stan Lee versus a composite version based on Joe Simon, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko. Check it out on the blog and read it. Regardless, Steve Ditko and Disney/Marvel settled credits a while back, and now the creator credits read just like they did back in Spider-Man's first appearance. So in the end of the day, who created what in Marvel 1960s between these 3 men? That's subject to how people interpret what is in writing on the topic, which is collected above. Some say that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko created characters before their time with Stan Lee, as well as after their time with Stan Lee, whereas Stan Lee didn't create as many raw characters before or after. Others say, well, the ones that Jack and Steve created with Stan shine the very brightest. At one point in both Jack and Stan's career, they say they were sole creators. Then they're also saying it was a co-creation at another time. At most, Steve Ditko says he created what was important in the visual character of Spider-Man, but still says it was a co-creation, where Stan gone from considering it a co-creation to claiming sole creatorship for the whole thing. And at the same time, Jack Kirby claimed sole creatorship at one time, although not as many times as Stan for Spider-Man. Some say the artist created the characters and that Stan exploited them for money and credit. Others say he was an editor that brought all the pieces together under one Marvel universe and that the dialogue was important characterization. Some go further to say that the words in the dialogue boxes were the voice of Marvel and attribute that solely to Stan. Some focus on the characters, visual, and action and don't care about the voice. As the dust is settled and the lawyers and estates individuals have testified or written, the final credits have emerged as co-creations. What really happened back then is up to interpretation, but common sense tends to guide many on who they feel is correct. Try getting into an online debate and both sides will vehemently defend their point of view. Where do you stand on this issue? That's up to you. A lot of it depends on what and who you value. Cheers.